so many different definitions to just quickly establish how I'm using them. Discipline, that's the easiest one. Academic community with shared interest, collective understandings of what methods are acceptable to use. Not everyone necessarily using all the same methods, but some understanding of what's suitable for what type of questions. Now, multidisciplinary research is two or more disciplines with people working together to address some common interest, but largely in parallel, not probably trying to actually write papers together, but looking at different issues around similar problems. Interdisciplinary, to me, is two or more disciplines working more together. Yes, they're asking this, well, questions they've agreed between them, or one person drawing on ideas, methods from different disciplines, perhaps, and yes, writing them up together to form one sort of combined story. Transdisciplinary research, I think, could be either interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. But the important thing for me about transdisciplinary research is that it includes non-academic partners who are actually part of discussing and designing what the research should be. So not just non-academic stakeholders who've been interviewed by an academic, but they're part of the conversation around the project. So a very crude diagram on the right here to show the sort of families of different disciplines: natural science, social science, engineering, arts and humanities. I'm sort of hovering now in that middle social science triangle. My work has involved collaborations with natural science, engineering, arts and humanities, not so much, but a little bit. And also some interdisciplinary work within social science, which seems to be where the more serious disagreements arise. But it's worth noting, of course, that these are families of disciplines. They cover huge varieties. So you could have very similar conversations about collaborations kind of within these triangles as well as between them. In some ways, even collaborating between the triangles is possibly easier because there's an acceptance of how different the modes of operation are, and maybe an acceptance that you would go about things differently. Whereas when the subjects are close together, maybe there's a little bit more of a feeling of things should be done in a certain way. So famously, there are sort of pros and cons to working with on across disciplines, let's say, to use a general kind of expression. One of the benefits, certainly if you're in my sort of line of work, is that you're bringing lots of different knowledges, perspectives to understanding real world problems. And this was mentioned this morning as well. So a list here of global issues, problems that cannot in any way be solved by one country working by itself, let alone by one discipline. There are sort of social, technical issues, human behavior, as well as the technical and sort of scientific constraints of what's going on. So bringing different people together can help you to address problems that you couldn't cope with or couldn't deal with individually. Sustainability research, this is fundamental for sustainability research. So again, sorry, I apologize for my somewhat crude diagrams, but we could characterize research relating to sustainability as being developing new technologies or new materials. And I'm going to talk about a project where chemistry colleagues were trying to develop biodegradable plastics. But there are also, of course, people out there studying the environment. How do rivers flow? Why do they flood? Where do they flood? And of course, there are sociologists, political scientists, human geographers studying social organization, each normally in isolation from each other. Where this becomes sustainability is in the overlaps. What are the environmental impacts of new technology? What environmental problems do we hope they might solve? What are the nature of interactions between humans and the environments, both obviously influencing and constraining each other? And perhaps most relevant to what I've been looking at over these years is the sort of the barriers to and or the impact of taking up new technology. So how the sort of social and technical interface with each other. So that's the advantages. We need to just briefly touch on some of the challenges, which I'm sure you've will have heard of or possibly directly experienced. So working with people who study different things in different ways, you need to build a shared vocabulary and a kind of common understanding of what it makes sense to study and how to go about it. Little cartoon here, which I think illustrates part of the problem very concisely in the ways of the best cartoons. The one person there who thinks only in terms of letters and the other one who thinks only in terms of numbers, obviously exaggerating, but there is an element of that, of people who are looking for, expecting a quantitative description or understanding of what's going on, and people who are more comfortable with, who may prioritize understanding the thoughts, the feelings that are better expressed in words. So that's the kind of barrier that you're trying to overcome. And in sort of practical terms or career terms, you're on the risk maybe of being judged at not being good at what you're doing because you're trying to combine different things. And essentially something has to be sacrificed. If you're combining, say, 2 or 3 different fields of literature, it's difficult to examine either as in depth as a disciplinary study might. So maybe we need different standards to judge into multidisciplinary studies to sort of to be able to appreciate the benefits that they're offering without the risk of them being seen as not as good as disciplinary work. And I say that because that's happened to me once or twice. So I will be exploring the following examples with an eye on the time. I'm not going to spend too long on this slide, but you can see briefly what is coming. So to start off with a multidisciplinary project, this one involved environmental science. It was led by environmental scientists. I was one of 2 teams of social scientists who were recruited to be part of this study, and there were also some engineers involved. This was responding to a call from the Natural Environmental Research Council in the UK, who had sort of discovered the issue of waste and wanted research into waste, and they wanted it to be multidisciplinary. They were after sort of quite elaborate projects, let's say. So our one was looking at the recovery and remediation of alkaline waste, which is produced by aluminium smelting, by as byproduct of coal-fired power generation, and also of steel production, which is what my part of the project focused on. And there is a nice mountain of steel slag, I'm told, somewhere in France. There are billions of tons of this around the world, but it is not just a waste. It contains metals that we see these days as being useful, things like vanadium that go into batteries that we need for renewable energy and so forth. So here's a description of the project. This was the actual official aim of the project, which emphasizes the sort of scientific elements of it, the natural science, the recovery of these metals. I might have summarized it in this way: establish an industrial symbiosis network, so that companies collaborating with each other, where one is using the waste product of another one in a different process, which is exactly what's sort of going on, recover these metals from steel slag to go into electronics from legacy waste. And that's a good picture of some legacy waste. There's some historically produced waste, so for use in the electronics industry. So here, the second definition is emphasizing the sort of the social challenges, almost sort of assuming we've got the materials, what are the problems with doing something with them next, which shouldn't be underestimated. And then a third way to put it, trying to avoid jargon as much as possible. So progressing the technical aspects, exploring the stakeholder perspectives and the regulatory constraints. So you can see how that's 3 different ways of describing the same project, each of which might appeal to people coming from a different sort of disciplinary background. Now, largely in this project, each group worked in parallel. The environmental scientists, geochemists were busy working on how to actually release these metals. Engineers would have been working on how to build up to sort of field scale and industrial operational scale. Actually, we never really quite got to that point. The science didn't progress at quite the rate predicted, hoped for. that's fine. Still some interesting outputs came from that. It left the social science being a bit more hypothetical. What would stakeholders think if this were to happen? But you can see the questions that we're asking there around policy constraints, the perspectives of the various stakeholders, and a whole list of them there involved in this in different ways. These steel manufacturers, the people managing the waste, people using the residues, regulators, people who might use the metals at the end of the day. So I was with a group of economic and environmental geographers addressing those questions. We also had a group of people from the business school who are systems theorists and operations research people. And so a bit of an issue there was that they essentially wanted to look at the same things as the geography group, but in a rather different way, which is a little bit redundant in some ways. What happened was that the geography group went ahead and did some interviews and started writing up in our way. The system theorists actually went on to do a different study, even more hypothetical, looking at communities living around these historic waste sites and asking them what they would think about progressing further on. So we had three sort of related aspects to it, but each one could sort of carry on without the other, well, except perhaps the engineering one was the one that was slightly less able to function independently. So outputs on the geography side, so we published one in a geography journal, GeoForum. They do sort of frame themselves as being an interdisciplinary journal, but it still did raise one or two questions when we submitted a paper that was trying to be sort of interdisciplinary across that boundary, so including some of the environmental science context as well, which in fact we had to reduce slightly to keep the journal sort of content with where we were going, but a relatively sort of trouble-free, ordinary process, let's say. And the other paper that came out did not include the environmental sciences. That was just very much focused on the regulations. That was published in a book that was drawn across the range of the projects that were funded as part of this call. Disadvantage of that is an extremely expensive book, so not too many people have read that chapter, unfortunately. So overall, I would say that the multidisciplinary aspect of this project was quite innovative at the time. It's almost become what's expected now to have the social scientists in there with the physical scientists. So it did probably help us to get the project funded at the time. The funders were very keen that the different projects, I think they funded 10 of them, would work together on the policy outputs, which didn't work as well for someone like me whose whole research topic is the policy. So not totally keen to sort of share it before I've had a chance to publish it, let's say. The lack of understanding from the environmental scientists who put the project together on exactly what social scientists could contribute did sort of leave us with this situation of possibly too many social scientists or not enough experience at working together to understand how we could have done a better job of that. Perhaps. So the environmental science was a little bit held up by regulatory complications, which I can discuss, but I won't dwell on now. I will just add that my geological background was quite useful here because I could have some level of understanding of what the natural scientists were saying. I mean, very little I felt, and no way that I could have joined in with what they were doing. But the other social scientists were just staring blankly, let's say literally, when we had a workshop together. So it did somehow help me to engage in communications, the fact that I had this sort of background, even if I wasn't directly using it on this occasion. So moving on to the second project, this was very much multidisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary. This was funded by the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council. And it was part of the British government's attempt to respond sort of swiftly to the emerging plastics crisis, this was probably 2017, 2018. So they made £8 million available to go sort of £1 million each to 8 universities. Now, usually when you're putting a grant together, as you'll realize, there are sort of benefits to showing that you've got partners at other universities. On this occasion, everyone had to be at the same university, But again, there was this sort of notion that the universities would cooperate with each other, which I think is not showing a huge understanding of how universities work, because it's very fierce competition. Nonetheless, this was Hull's answer, our project evolving a circular plastics economy, trying to generate some transformative steps towards more environmental use of plastics, using the chemists I mentioned earlier, looking at their biodegradable plastics, but also geography, law, politics, education, economics, behavioral psychology, and probably others not yet on that list. And you can see how we contextualize sort of the problems of plastics, their various features, which make them cheap to use, meaning they're used far too abundantly, they're light in weight, cheap to move around, but then they get distributed within the environment and they last a very long time. And of course, they are generally made using fossil fuel, though the chemists were trying to get around that. So I don't want to dwell too much on the project, but you can see here the sort of framework that we designed in the middle there, unfortunately in small print, consultation with the partners, so the non-academic partners, and we'll see who they were shortly. So people who use, distribute, make, dispose of, collect, reuse plastics, trying to understand how they do that, what they would want from new types of plastic. So who was involved? We had the chemists trying to design new types of plastics, chemical engineers looking at how to collect and safely dispose of current types of plastics, politics, geography, English language, working together to understand the governance of the plastic landscape, you might say. How can we best take this forward? How do the different stakeholders relate to each other? People in the business school were working on supply chain logistics. Other groups were involved as well. Computer science, looking at communication, use of artificial intelligence. The drama department wanted to put a dance on. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that became more of a spoken exercise, but nonetheless, some huge imagination being applied. Education was involved, environmental science and psychology. So a very large group of people, which is slightly problematic. The way grants work in the UK, if you are listing the academic staff involved, and in some ways rightly so, you have to account for their time. And so quite a lot of the money from the grant went on time being put into it by this whole raft of academics. Now, the downside of that was that we couldn't afford more than 4 researchers, who are the people who actually do the frontline work on the project. So it did end up being sort of constrained by time, and imagine as well 4 people trying to cover all of these areas somehow. Between them, the project network was even bigger than that. The subjects in the middle, the sort of the supply chain that was represented within our project around that. Then you have some of the funders and some other groups who were involved in our advisory group, which included the Department of the Environment from the UK government, and then a whole collection around that of companies and local authorities and company advisory groups and others who were involved in this project. So this was a huge network to keep in touch with, to do things with. Partly this was put together by an adventurous person in the university research office who collected as many people as she possibly could. And this did leave us with a bit of a task, because the companies really wanted sort of individual consultation. They were not so happy to sort of share their views of what they wanted from new plastics or how they dispose of their plastics within the wider group, which did sort of limit the way we could operate slightly. We didn't really at all have the resources to provide the individual attention that the some of the partners would have preferred. So what was the design of this project? Well, it was to get us all together first, so partly so that the people within the university could learn about each other. And I didn't mention earlier that we only had 18 months to do this project, which is very sort of ambitious, that we would somehow be solving the world's public plastic problems within 18 months. But never mind, that was the goal that we were working to. So we had these collective exercises to get to know each other and to get to know the stakeholders. Then the work package work was going on separately, the chemists working in the lab and so on, and my group speaking to and working with stakeholders separately to try to understand their views on the bigger picture. There were a group of smaller projects, which I haven't got time to go into, that kind of focused on particular issues and very much trying to respond to the demands of the partners. We tried to bring it all together at the end and wrote a report, which we then shared with the partners so that we could see how they felt the exercise had gone and give them a chance to disagree with what we might have found. So it's quite an elaborate design and, say, a lot to get through in 18 months. The outputs, so mostly these have been written by sort of separate small groups, generally tending to be disciplinary in their focus. And I think that's fine. I think that type of work is needed to contribute towards solving this world plastics problem. In this case, two examples of interdisciplinary work, although we might debate whether it's inter or multidisciplinary. I had a small part in the computer studies or computer science study where I sort of contributed some narration around the circular economy and how different stakeholders might view the communications. A PhD student in computing was working with artificial intelligence, but not just applying it. He was kind of designing a program to improve the sort of use of artificial intelligence to harvest and interpret views on plastics from social media. The other interdisciplinary study was geography and English language. So this was quite novel. We were looking at stakeholders' views on how they sort of fit into this bigger picture with each other. And was kind of a standard type of study that a geographer or a political science person might do. But with our English language college, we were able to analyze these sort of the words used and get a deeper understanding of the implications of how the stakeholders were expressing themselves. And just give one sort of small example here, the public was seen in sort of various contradictory ways as sort of obviously they are in a sense a stakeholder, they're buying products and demanding or asking for more environmental products, but actually not necessarily being prepared or perhaps able to pay for them. So they're kind of dismissed as being sort of passive bystanders, not having an active role in bringing about a sort of plastics transformation. Companies kind of saw that as being their own duty, let's say. So reflections from that, it did build a lot of new connections within the university. Numerous people, including me, in fact, now no longer work for the university, so we haven't been able to capitalize on that. There are various sort of problems with the way the project designed. As I mentioned, we really did need more research staff because lecturing staff, although they're needed to bring their expertise, of course, have to give lectures. So we probably didn't really meet as many times as we should have done. Stakeholders said some very nice things about the experience of being part of the project at the end, but it was very difficult to balance their individual requests with the sort of the larger collective demands of the project. And this project was very badly hit by the pandemic because the campus closed. We couldn't obviously have face-to-face meetings, which we really particularly did need for this type of project, which part of which was to study the way plastics are used on campus. Well, obviously not much at that point. So we'll move on to the third of the four examples. This one I'm calling interdisciplinary, and this is me representing social science or human geography with some colleagues in systems engineering. Now, I knew these people because we taught on a multidisciplinary masters in environmental technology. I taught waste management, they taught eco-design. So I asked them if they'd be interested in a collaborative project, and they were. This took, I think a couple of years for us to get to the point where we really understood what each other was talking about and how we could work together on something that was interesting to all of us. Now, their interest was to improve the sustainability of products by examining the design, product design phase and making sure that sustainability is included there as what designers call a functional requirement. So the sustainability of a product should be every bit as important as how well it meets health and safety regulations, its ability to do what the person who is buying it wants it to do. So that was their contribution, that they had insights into product design and, of course, into sustainability, and thought of a way of putting them both together. My sort of geography contribution to this is to sort of understand that local authorities in Britain, like the City of Hull for one, have the regulatory responsibility to manage household waste. They also have targets to increase recycling, but they have no control over what is presented to them. So we have to go upstream a bit and speak to the manufacturers. So you see where the sort of the overlap was. We both could see the importance of manufacturers. But the engineers kind of had this system that they wanted the manufacturers to introduce. I was kind of wondering, well, what's happening now? Are they thinking about sustainability already? What are the challenges that they might face in trying to improve the practice that they have at present? One of the biggest challenges, in fact, turns out that product designers are not trained in environmental issues. So there's a fundamental barrier there. Even if they wanted to implement eco-design, they simply didn't know how to do it. So after much discussion and deliberation, we ended up with two publications from this project. One is more of a sort of theoretical approach. What are the problems here with waste management, the lack of control of the waste managers? Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water. And the fact that we need to introduce these sort of principles of eco-design and sustainability. So this was a very much an interdisciplinary paper, putting together literature that isn't necessarily found together. If only we had a crystal ball and mentioned the word circular economy in the keywords of this paper, it won't be cited many more times. It's slightly too far ahead of its time in some ways. Anyway, one of the comments that came back from a reviewer was that it didn't cover the literature that that person expected. Now, I'm not sure what the reviewer expected, but as I say, it did cover quite a substantial area of literature, and I think that might be a case where one would have to say you can't do everything, and hopefully maybe respect something for what it is. The other paper was an empirical paper, included interviews and a questionnaire survey of companies. Now, this was probably not the wisest idea to put these together in one paper, because then you run into sort of issues between the people who prefer the qualitative and the quantitative research, and it was a lot to put into one paper. But of course, you do get different insights, and a sort of quantitative study sort of sets the scene of what is happening. By the qualitative aspects, by the interviews, you can maybe start to understand why at least some people are doing things the way they are. So I can see what I was trying to do there. I wouldn't necessarily do it the same way again. The reviews here, interesting. Someone coming, I think, from a marketing background wanted us to go a bit further in justifying the use of interviews. They weren't opposing a qualitative approach, but they wanted it to be very explicitly justified. So, of course, we happily did that. The paper's published, and a comment I got from someone else later on was, why is the methodology so sort of elaborate about you don't have to justify that? Well, of course, in geography you don't, but in other disciplines you do. And Journal of Cleaner Production is very much appealing across a wide range of disciplines. So I think the first reviewer was right that we needed to be a bit more explicit in what we were doing. The Journal of Cleaner Production is the only one that both the engineers and I were both familiar with, so that did seem like a good target for an outlet. Experience here, I'd be interested to see if other people have had similar experiences, contrasting the engineering and the social science. The engineers started with the answer. They thought from their sort of experience of meeting, they knew what the answer to this problem of how to make products more sustainable is, which was very nice, and that was the cornerstone of what we did. But I was more interested in trying to understand what companies are doing now They were more keen to tell the companies what they should do. So part of our approach to methodology here was that the interview should be conducted by both an engineer and a social scientist, which resulted in me crossing my fingers that the companies would be allowed to tell us what they were doing before the engineer butted in and told them what they should be doing. So we had a close call a couple of times. They were the statistics experts, but it turned out not to be the type of statistics they were expecting. The engineers used to working with lots of large numbers. This was sort of categorical data, asking sort of, do you do this, that, or the other? Do you agree or agree strongly, Likert scale type of data, which is much more familiar to geographers, but I was not claiming to be the statistics expert. So I had to do a bit of background reading on that. Engineers, it seems, have a greater reluctance to cite literature, whereas for geographers, you've got to absolutely show, and perhaps coming through from that reviewer as well, you've got to link to previous ideas. I was hoping my colleagues would do a demonstration of how to design something. That was really not what they wanted to do at all. So there's some sort of interesting learning experience that we all went through as a result of that project. So I will move on to my last example. This was funded by the European Union. It's part of a much bigger project, but in this particular case is an interdisciplinary social science exercise. So we're trying to understand the experience of working in a circular economy. So that's an economy where products are made to last as long as possible or to be easily repaired or perhaps reused. So no one really has thought too much about the experience of the worker in this situation. Most of the research is come from the point of view of companies. How could we design things differently? Not so much about what the implications of that might be or what it's like to actually be the person who, in this case, we were looking at people working in repair. These are very tiny companies, perhaps just one person working by themselves or maybe with one or two employees. So the PhD student doing this project interviewed the repairers. And so we ended up combining two very interdisciplinary or perhaps multidisciplinary literatures. So quality of working life, on the left there, you can see the different disciplines that engage in debates around that: sociology, economics, business, human resources, management, probably others as well. Circular economy is a very wide area. And of course, if we're going to sort of reinvent the way the economy works, it probably needs to be studied from multiple angles. So just several examples there of the types of fields that are engaging in circular economy research. But these two particular aspects have not been brought together before. So the contributions that we made, and bearing in mind earlier what I said about the risk of sort of trying to do everything and not being considered good at anything. So interesting here, circular economy, our contribution was that this wasn't an analytical study. It was looking at the impact rather than sort of a more typical trying to drive the circular economy type of study. It was very unusual in looking at an individual scale, the actual human experience of, as I say, of working, of actually being part of the circular economy. And as part of that, also looked at the constraints, the concerns of very tiny companies, which are not the normal focus. So it was quite novel in that area. It was also novel in its sort of approach to quality of working life. Most of that literature, in fact, is highly quantitative. There's been a more recent shift towards a qualitative approach. Again, it's more recently taken on issues around self-employment rather than working for sort of large corporations, and novel in that it's working on an environmental sector, whereas, of course, this is sort of course, is only one of very many different sectors that might be taken on by that area. So it was quite novel in both areas that we were taking on board. It turned out to be very difficult to get this one published. It was turned down by an interdisciplinary journal that I won't name, but it's got the word work in the title. We thought might be interested, trying to get a sort of a slightly different audience, because we thought this might be of interest beyond the circular economy. Now, this is mostly a sociology type of journal, but does describe itself as being interdisciplinary, but the editor rejected the journal as being too much geography, which we didn't really actually think it particularly was at all. So I'm not sure quite where that person was coming from. It was then turned down by an interdisciplinary sustainability journal on the grounds of being too qualitative. Now, that was a bit of a shock to us, because this journal definitely publishes qualitative research. But unfortunately, the sort of sub-editor that we were assigned to is an economist who does very quantitative studies of supply chain. So I can see why that person might not have felt it was the article for them, but I feel there's some sort of barrier to accessing a journal there that kind of on another day of the week might well have been interested in this article. We found a journal for it, I'm happy to say, the Journal of Circular Economy and Sustainability, which in some ways is the perfect journal, but of course that is very much focusing towards the circular economy community. So great, the paper's out there, hopefully people will see it, but we didn't manage to get quite the audience that we had hoped the paper might have been suitable for. So to sum up the challenges coming out of these experiences, the time needed is an important one. That 18-month plastics project was never going to have enough time to sort of build the relationships and do the level of integrated work that we had hoped we might. Another lesson of that project and the Steel Side project is that the team needs to be designed around the needs of the project. Don't sort of collect together a group of people who you think might be suitable and then try to work out what is happening. I mean, that could work out very well on some occasions, but if you've got something in mind that you want the project to be about, then think about who is suitable to contribute to that. Some of the worst sort of misunderstandings, clashes I've had around multidisciplinary issue have been sort of out with the project boundaries, the reviewers' comments that I've sort of shared, some of them, the expectations of the funding bodies or other colleagues sort of passing judgment that are not necessarily within the project. Within the projects themselves, there's a certain sort of preparedness to learn from each other and sort of sympathy to the way different groups might do things. Of course, other colleagues or individuals who are not necessarily themselves involved in this type of work may not appreciate the challenges. So interdependence of the project elements, yes, if you're bringing lots of separate things together and trying to combine them, they've still got to be able to function separately, just in case something in one area doesn't work out quite the way expected. Everything else can't be totally dependent on that. More challenges, I think, within the social sciences, but then between these sort of disciplinary families, where I think the greater the differences between the work, the more sort of preparedness there is to believe the other person that they need to do things in a certain way. I think within the social science, there are some sort of very firm camps towards the qualitative and the quantitative, who, well, as we saw in that experience over just the last couple of years, even after many sort of decades of efforts towards interdisciplinary research, there's still some fairly fixed views out there, unfortunately. So come to the end, why go or why engage in this type of research? Well, of course, it does offer the potential to address these sort of very complicated real world problems and sort of build your project around a problem that you might like to help solving. I think it's also just a very interesting intellectual exercise, so definitely worth it for the curiosity to see how different people work, what they consider to be the important questions. Do they have methods that you might be able to apply in a slightly different way? And it also very much helps you to understand yourself better. So I started out describing myself as an interdisciplinary social scientist. I think I've got much more geography coming through that than I necessarily realized at the beginning, or maybe it's come through more over the years. I'm not totally sure, but sort of by contrasting the way I was thinking with other social scientists, then I could see that the geography arguments coming through. So it has been a sort of an interesting self-learning experience, apart from any possible contributions I've made to the wider literature. I would say that I think this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research is complementary to, rather than a substitute for, more traditional disciplinary research, which perhaps is still the way that the work is going to be sort of carried forward in more, or in certain respects. You need both, of course, but I think different sort of approaches, maintaining a healthy respect and collaboration for each other, sounds very idealistic to end up with. But anyway, I think I have said enough. I'll be very happy to join in discussion. Comments that anyone might have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so very much, Professor Molly, for that great presentation. We have very your debate on the topic, maybe the history society, not very environmental debate. I want to take advantage to the efforts needed to add and make the consultation between three technologies that we need interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and I appreciate the note on which you made your presentation today, which is on the question of why work beyond discipline. And of course, you have done very well to highlight the important advantages of adopting the multidisciplinary approach in research and academics as a whole. And you have taken care to tell us very clear time some of the important benefits of doing so. In my own words, I would just say that the multidisciplinary approach provides us an opportunity to have a more holistic understanding of the real life issues that we contend with, not just in social sciences, but in practically all domains of life. And in as much as we recognize that virtually all issues of life are multifaceted, they are quite complex, and they most times do not afford of any easy solution from just one discipline. And that is why it is important that we adopt the multidisciplinary approach in our efforts to address real life issues across our diverse domains of life. So on behalf of the organizers of this conference, I want to say thank you so very much for the important insights you have brought into the topic you have addressed today. We really appreciate you, and I believe that you wouldn't mind if we share your slides with the participants of this conference so that they can have a further opportunity to interrogate the issues you have raised and discussed so eloquently. At this point, I'll just want to ask the participants of this conference to please give our esteemed keynote lecturer a resounding round of applause. Thank you so much, Professor Dukes. And having said that, I want to hand over back to the anchor of this event, please. Thank you very much.
A round of applause for the chair. We deliberately moved the lunch break to the end because we knew that we just came from the session and we couldn't allow our online keynote speaker to wait for too long. So that's why we're moving from that plenary session, technical sessions, straight to the keynote address plenary session. Now we are through for the day, except for one item. I don't know which item it is. Is it 7 or 6? But this item 7 stay and it's not at the 7 go. Not the 7 go in Ibadan now. Yes. Okay, so a quick announcement or some quick announcement. So after the lunch now is almost becoming evening food. We give priority to those who have registered. You all eat, no doubt, but we give priority to those who have registered. So you will not be allowed to go into the cafeteria if you don't have a meal ticket. If you go there without a meal ticket, it won't allow entry, right? But just be seated. By the time everybody is done, everybody that has a ticket is done, then you will go in and have your meal.